Politicians are carved into statues. Writers, thinkers, and leaders leave behind shelves of books, volumes of speeches, and endless records of their deeds. But every now and then, history skips a beat. A life that should have been impossible to erase simply vanishes. Think about it. Most disappearances we hear of involve ordinary people, the kind whose absence becomes a footnote in a local newspaper. But the people we're about to talk about were anything but ordinary. These were men with influence, talent, dangerous knowledge, the sort who made enemies in high places or lived at the edge of danger. And yet somehow they walked into the shadows of history and never came back out. This isn't a story about chance accidents or lost travelers. This is about disappearances that shake confidence in what we think we know. Disappearances that feel wrong, almost unnatural, because the people involved weren't supposed to vanish at all. They had too much power, too much visibility, too much weight on the world stage. And still, they slipped through history's cracks, leaving behind empty rooms, unanswered letters, and whispers of conspiracy. What makes these vanishings so unsettling is not just the lack of closure. It's that the stories almost always carry a shadow of motive. When a man exposes corruption in government, then disappears, we wonder who might have wanted him silenced. When a famous author obsessed with death wanders into a war zone, never to be seen again, we question whether he found the ending he was writing toward all along. When a diplomat disappears in the middle of enemy territory during a war, we're left wondering if he was killed for secrets, or if something stranger happened. The cases we're about to explore are not the sort that fill school textbooks. They're not polished legends you'll find in glossy documentaries. These are stories that slipped out of the mainstream, left for curious historians, amateur detectives, and the occasional truth seeker to piece together. And yet, each of them holds enough mystery, enough tension, to stand toe-to-toe with the great conspiracies of history. Imagine being in the crowd in 1920s London, hearing the firebrand socialist Victor Grayson denounce a government scandal, and then learning he vanished the very next night. Imagine reading the final letters of Ambrose Bierce, the American writer who loved to toy with death in his fiction, only to see him walk into the chaos of the Mexican Revolution and never return. Imagine the shock of diplomats in Europe when Benjamin Bathurst, a British envoy, excused himself one night in 1809, and in the blink of an eye, he was gone, never to be found again. 3 men, 3 different times, 3 vanishings that still don't make sense. As we move through their stories, you'll notice a pattern. Each disappearance has enough fragments of evidence to keep the case alive, but never enough to solve it. Each has plausible explanations that break down under closer inspection, and in each there's a question hovering in the background. Was this chance, or was someone pulling strings to make sure these voices disappeared? Disappearance is one of the deepest human fears. To leave no trace, no answer, no closure. And when that happens to people of influence, it doesn't just haunt their families, it haunts history itself. In this journey, we're not looking for neat resolutions. In fact, part of what makes these stories so compelling is that they resist closure. The missing pages stay missing, the locked files stay sealed, the rumours never quite fade. What we're left with are shadows, and the uneasy realization that if such people can vanish, then perhaps no one is safe from being erased. Victor Grayson's story begins not with his disappearance, but with his sudden and shocking rise. In the early 1900s, British politics was still dominated by aristocrats, industrialists, and polished gentlemen of the establishment. Into this world stepped a fiery young man from humble origins, whose voice carried the kind of energy that could ignite a crowd. His name was Victor Grayson, and for a brief, dazzling moment, he looked like the future of British socialism. Grayson was born in 1881 in Liverpool, the son of a poor couple who struggled to make ends meet. From an early age, he experienced hardship, the kind of poverty that shaped his later fury against injustice. Unlike many politicians of his time, he wasn't born into privilege. He clawed his way up through determination and talent, driven by a sharp intellect and a knack for public speaking that few could rival. By the time he entered politics, the British Labour movement was gaining strength but still fragile. The party often compromised with liberals and moderates, unwilling to push too hard against the establishment. Grayson, however, had no patience for compromise. He wanted revolution, not reform. His fiery speeches electrified working-class audiences. He spoke not in the polished tones of Parliament, but in the raw, emotional language of the streets. People who heard him didn't just nod politely. They roared, they cheered, they believed. In 1907, at just 26 years old, Grayson stunned the political world. Running as an independent socialist in a by-election in Colne Valley, Yorkshire, he defeated both the Liberal and Conservative candidates. No one expected him to win. Newspapers called it a political earthquake. Suddenly, this young man with no backing from the Labour Party machine, no powerful family connections, and no financial base, was in Parliament. From the very beginning, Grayson made it clear he would not play by the rules. He attacked both the government and his own supposed allies. When the Labour Party leadership urged him to moderate his tone, he refused. He interrupted speeches in the House of Commons, he shouted down ministers, and he accused the political elite of being corrupt to their core. While some found him reckless, many ordinary people found him refreshing. For the first time, someone was saying out loud what they whispered in the pubs and workshops. But the establishment does not take kindly to rebels. Grayson quickly made enemies. His flamboyant style, the bright red ties, the defiant swagger, the sharp tongue, made him an easy target. Cartoonists mocked him, newspapers ridiculed him, and even within his own movement, many tried to sideline him, embarrassed by his refusal to compromise. Yet Grayson refused to fade. Even when he lost his seat in 1910, he remained a public figure, giving lectures and writing articles that kept his name alive. By the end of the First World War, though, his life had taken a darker turn. He drank heavily. He lived extravagantly, often beyond his means. His circle of friends shifted from idealistic activists to more questionable characters. Still, he had one weapon left: his voice. And in 1920, he used it to launch an accusation that would put his life in danger. That year, rumours swirled about a scandal at the very top of government. Prime Minister David Lloyd George's administration was accused of selling honours, knighthoods and peerages, in exchange for huge sums of money. It was corruption on a grand scale, a way of turning the British honour system into a marketplace. Many suspected it, but few dared say it outright. Victor Grayson, however, had no fear. At a public meeting in London, he stood up and thundered against the government. He spoke of a monocled dandy at the centre of the scheme, a reference many believed pointed to Maundy Gregory, Lloyd George's infamous fixer, a man known to traffic in political secrets and shady deals. Grayson promised he would soon reveal names. He declared the scandal a national disgrace and vowed to expose those profiting from it. It was a bold move, but also a dangerous one. To challenge the Prime Minister's inner circle was to paint a target on one's own back. Grayson was already seen as a nuisance, a man without party loyalty, unpredictable and impossible to control. Now, with his accusations, he had become more than a nuisance. He had become a threat. And it was in the weeks following this outburst that his life took its most mysterious and terrifying turn. The night Victor Grayson vanished seemed ordinary at first. It was September 28, 1920, and Grayson was in London. Despite his declining fortunes, he still kept up the appearance of a social man, drinking, laughing, and moving through the smoky pubs of the city. He wasn't the rising star he had once been, but he was still recognisable, still a figure who turned heads. That night he was in the company of friends, but nothing in his behaviour suggested that his story was about to end abruptly. At some point in the evening, Grayson received a phone call. Exactly who was on the other end of the line has never been confirmed. Witnesses recalled that his demeanour changed after he took it. He excused himself from the gathering, saying he would be back shortly. He stepped out into the London night, and from that moment forward, Victor Grayson was never seen again. No body was ever discovered. No note, no farewell letter, no explanation. He simply evaporated into the fog of London. For a man so flamboyant, so public, the silence that followed was deafening. In the days after his disappearance, rumours swirled. Some claimed he had run off abroad, tired of political battles and personal debts. Others whispered that he had been seen in South America or even in New Zealand. But none of these claims were ever proven. What made his disappearance more suspicious was the timing. He had just threatened to reveal details about the Cash for Honours scandal. He had named names, hinted at more to come, and directly challenged men with deep pockets and powerful friends. To some, it seemed almost too convenient that he disappeared before he could deliver on his promise. One theory suggests he was murdered, silenced before he could speak again. If this is true, then who ordered it? Was it the shadowy fixer Maundy Gregory, known to be ruthless in protecting his own secrets and those of his allies? Was it the government itself, eager to remove a dangerous loudmouth who refused to play by their rules? Or was it an opportunistic attack, a robbery or drunken brawl gone wrong, conveniently aligning with his threats? Another possibility is more subtle, that Grayson wasn't killed, but bought, that someone paid him enough money or offered him protection in exchange for disappearing. This theory paints Grayson not as a martyr, but as a man who chose survival over truth. Could the radical firebrand have been tempted by the very corruption he despised? Some historians think it unlikely, but the absence of evidence keeps the idea alive. And then there are the stranger accounts. One man later claimed he saw Grayson being ushered into a house on the Thames, a house known to belong to Maundy Gregory. If true, it would suggest Grayson didn't simply vanish into the night. He was taken, escorted into a place from which he never returned. But this story, like so many others, remains unverified. What deepens the mystery is the fact that government files on Grayson's disappearance remain sealed. Even a century later, requests for their release have been denied. Why? If Grayson had simply run off, why would those records need to remain hidden? The very act of keeping them secret only fuels the suspicion that his disappearance wasn't a random misfortune, but an intentional erasure. For decades, conspiracy theories have circled around Grayson's fate. To some, he is the doomed truth-teller, silenced by a corrupt system that could not allow his voice to echo any longer. To others, he is a tragic figure who drank and gambled away his future, and whose disappearance was less a grand conspiracy than a sad collapse. But whichever story you believe, the fact remains. No trace of him was ever found. Imagine being in his circle of friends, waiting for him to return that night, expecting to hear his booming voice again, only to find out he had walked into history's shadows. Imagine being one of his supporters, waiting for the promised revelations, only to hear nothing but silence. Victor Grayson's disappearance left more than just an unsolved case. It left a haunting gap in British politics, a reminder that those who stand too loudly against the system sometimes don't get the chance to finish their sentence. Ambrose Bierce was not an ordinary writer. By the time of his disappearance, he had earned the nickname Bitter Bierce for his sharp tongue and even sharper pen. Born in 1842 in Ohio, Bierce grew up in a poor family, one of 13 children. He fought in the American Civil War, where he experienced some of the most brutal battles: Shiloh, Chickamauga, Kennesaw Mountain. Those memories seared themselves into him. The war gave him not only scars, but also the grim, ironic worldview that would define his writing for the rest of his life. When he later became a journalist and author, he didn't sugarcoat the world. His most famous work, The Devil's Dictionary, was a masterpiece of dark wit. In it, Bierce redefined common words with biting cynicism. For example, cynic, a blackguard whose faulty vision sees things as they are, not as they ought to be. He mocked politics, religion, love, and death with equal precision, and readers both loved and feared his honesty. Bierce's short stories were just as cutting. An occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, his most famous, blurred the line between life and death, time and illusion. He had a fascination with mortality that was both chilling and magnetic. He didn't just write about death, he seemed to court it. By the early 20th century, Bierce was in his 70s, a successful but restless man. He had lived through war, scandal, and personal tragedy, including the death of his son and the collapse of his marriage. He was admired for his brilliance, but he was also isolated, estranged from many of his contemporaries. Perhaps he was tired of American life, tired of the hypocrisy he'd spent his career mocking. In 1913, Bierce made a decision that shocked his friends. He announced he was traveling to Mexico. At the time, Mexico was in the midst of violent revolution. Pancho Villa and other revolutionary leaders were waging war against government forces. To most people, it was a dangerous, chaotic place to avoid at all costs. But to Ambrose Bierce, it was irresistible. He told friends he wanted to witness the revolution firsthand, maybe even join in. Some said he was looking for a dramatic ending, a fitting close to a life obsessed with death and destiny. Before leaving, he wrote to a friend with words that now sound eerily prophetic. "To be a gringo in Mexico, that is euthanasia." Bierce crossed the border and made his way south, documenting his journey in letters. He travelled through Texas, then Chihuahua, where Pancho Villa's forces were based. His letters were full of descriptions of the landscape, the battles, the people he encountered. At first, there was no sign of danger. He seemed invigorated, almost rejuvenated by the adventure. But as he drew closer to Villa's army, his letters grew sparse. In December 1913, he wrote his final confirmed letter to a friend. He mentioned he was heading to the town of Ojinaga, where Villa was planning a major attack. And then, nothing. No one ever heard from him again. The vanishing of Ambrose Bierce was unlike most disappearances. This wasn't an unknown man slipping into obscurity. This was one of America's most famous writers, a man whose words were read across the country, suddenly gone in a foreign land torn apart by revolution. At first, some thought he'd be back, that this was just another dark adventure to fuel his writing. But as the weeks turned into months, the silence became impossible to ignore, and soon, rumours began to swirl. Some claimed he was executed by firing squad after being captured by government troops. Others believed he was travelling with Villa's men and simply died in battle, his body left unrecognised on the field. Still others suggested he chose to vanish intentionally, to disappear into myth, leaving the world guessing. But the truth? It remains as elusive as the man himself. The disappearance of Ambrose Bierce has haunted readers, historians, and conspiracy theorists for more than a century. A man so famous, so sharp, so deeply woven into American letters, and then simply gone. What makes it especially unsettling is how perfectly his vanishing mirrored the themes he spent his life exploring: irony, death, and the unknowable. Let's start with the most accepted theory, that Bierce joined Pancho Villa's army and died during the Mexican Revolution. Some witnesses, years later, claimed they remembered seeing an older American gringo travelling with Villa's troops. A few said he had been executed by firing squad after being caught in a government sweep. Others insisted he was killed in battle, his body indistinguishable among the fallen. Mexico in 1913 and 1914 was chaotic, with mass graves and unmarked casualties. If Bierce did die there, it's not surprising that no record survived. But skeptics argue this doesn't fit. Bierce was too famous for such an ending to vanish without trace. Surely someone, a soldier, a journalist, even Pancho Villa himself, would have noted the death of the great American writer. Why are there no reliable records, no final words, no confirmation? Another possibility is that Bierce, ever the dramatist, staged his disappearance. Some biographers suggest he deliberately vanished as his ultimate final act, an ending written by himself on his own terms. He was a man who believed life was absurd, cruel, and unpredictable. What better way to embody that philosophy than to step off the stage without explanation? In this sense, Bierce's disappearance becomes less a mystery and more a performance, his own vanishing act as literature. But the theories don't stop there. More conspiratorial ideas claim that Bierce was assassinated for his writings. At the time, he had been working on exposing corruption within the US government, especially involving wealthy industrialists and financiers. Some wonder if his sudden departure to Mexico was not a coincidence, but a convenient cover for silencing him permanently. There's no hard evidence for this, but in the absence of facts, suspicion grows. Then there are those who believe Bierce never went to Mexico at all. According to this view, his letters from the border were fabrications, and his disappearance was planned well in advance. He may have slipped into anonymity elsewhere, South America perhaps, living out his final years away from fame, controversy, and the shadow of death that followed him all his life. And yet, every one of these theories runs into the same wall: the silence. Bierce left no trace after December 1913. No eyewitness we can fully trust. No body, no grave. just empty space where certainty should be. This void has fueled Bierce's legend. In a strange way, his disappearance gave him the immortality he always seemed to chase. Had he died quietly in America, he might be remembered as a cynical wit, a sharp critic, and a war-haunted storyteller. But by vanishing into Mexico's revolutionary chaos, he became something more, a ghostly figure, a man who blurred the line between fiction and reality, life and myth. His disappearance also resonates because it reflects universal fears. We want death to make sense. We want closure, finality, answers. Bierce gave us none. Instead, he left us staring into the same abyss he wrote about in his stories. A man who wrote so vividly about the thin veil between life and death slipped behind that veil without explanation. A man who mocked certainty left us with none. A man who dealt in irony staged, or stumbled into, the most ironic ending of all. To this day, historians, readers and travellers retrace his steps in northern Mexico, hoping to stumble across some fragment of truth. But perhaps that's exactly how Bierce wanted it. To remain forever a question mark, a riddle, a story without an ending. The Devil's Dictionary defined absent as a person accounted for. Bierce himself is absent in the most literal, haunting sense, accounted for in history yet never found in reality. And so Ambrose Bierce remains, both present and absent, both legend and mystery, a man who wrote about death and then became its most enduring enigma. On a cold November evening in 1809, a British diplomat named Benjamin Bathurst stepped outside an inn in the small German town of Perleberg. He had been travelling under a false name, nervous, careful, glancing over his shoulder at every turn. War raged across Europe. Napoleon's armies dominated the continent, and Bathurst was deep in enemy territory. He told his aides he was going to check on the horses. He walked into the darkness, and he was never seen again. To understand why Bathurst's disappearance still chills historians, we need to step back into the world of early 19th century Europe. This was the height of the Napoleonic Wars, a time when nations were shifting alliances, secret treaties were being drafted, and espionage was rampant. Britain and France were locked in a bitter struggle for supremacy. Every diplomat was a potential spy, every conversation a possible death sentence if overheard by the wrong ear. Benjamin Bathurst was not just any diplomat. Born in 1784, he was the son of Henry Bathurst, Bishop of Norwich, and came from a respected English family. Well-educated, ambitious, and trusted by the British government, he was appointed as envoy to the court of Austria. His mission? To persuade Austria to join Britain in resisting Napoleon's growing empire. For a while, Bathurst's work seemed promising, but Napoleon was relentless. By 1809, Austria had been defeated, forced into yet another humiliating treaty. Bathurst's mission collapsed, and with his diplomatic cover blown, he knew he was a marked man. Napoleon had little patience for foreign diplomats meddling in his affairs, and those suspected of spying often met grim fates. Bathurst decided to flee. He travelled across Germany under an assumed name, Baron de Kock, taking back roads, avoiding major cities, and relying on hired carriages to carry him through hostile territory. He was accompanied by his valet, a loyal servant named Kraus. But even with these precautions, Bathurst was terrified. He confided to friends along the way that he felt hunted. Certain French agents were following him. By late November, Bathurst's journey had brought him to the town of Perleberg, north of Berlin. He stopped at the inn Zum Weißen Schwan, the White Swan, where he ordered horses to be readied for the next leg of the journey. Witnesses described him as anxious, pacing, constantly looking over his shoulder. He ate little, spoke quickly, and seemed desperate to keep moving. Then came the moment that has baffled historians ever since. After waiting for his horses to be prepared, Bathurst suddenly excused himself from his companions and walked outside into the cold evening. He said he wanted to check on the carriage. Kraus, his valet, waited inside. Minutes passed, then more. Bathurst never returned. At first, his companions assumed he had stepped into another room or gone for a short walk. But when the carriage was ready and Bathurst was nowhere to be found, panic set in. A search of the inn revealed nothing, The surrounding streets were combed, but no trace of the young diplomat could be found. It was as if he had melted into the night. Authorities were alerted, and soon the town was buzzing with speculation. Had French agents intercepted him, dragging him into the shadows? Had he been ambushed by local bandits? Or, as some whispered, had he gone mad from fear and fled into the wilderness, never to be seen again? The strange thing was that Bathurst's disappearance left behind only fragments of evidence. Days later, his fur-lined greatcoat and a pair of pantaloons, believed to be his, were found hidden in a nearby woodshed. Some claimed to have seen suspicious figures loitering in town on the night he vanished. Others insisted Bathurst himself had been muttering about betrayal and treachery in the days before. What makes the case even stranger is the sense of precision about it. Bathurst didn't vanish in the wilderness or on a battlefield. He disappeared in the middle of a town with companions nearby, under circumstances where discovery should have been inevitable, and yet he was gone without a sound. By the time word reached London, Bathurst's disappearance had already begun to take on a mythic quality. Here was a diplomat, young, ambitious and connected, vanishing in the middle of Europe at the height of the Napoleonic Wars. It had all the makings of a political thriller. But unlike the novels of the time, this story had no resolution. The disappearance of Benjamin Bathurst sent shockwaves through Europe. A British diplomat, vanishing in broad daylight. It wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political embarrassment. The British press seized on the story, portraying Bathurst as a victim of Napoleon's ruthless spies. If French agents could snatch a man so easily, what did that mean for the safety of anyone opposing Napoleon's empire? At first, the local authorities in Perleberg treated the case as a routine missing person investigation. They interviewed townspeople, questioned the inn staff, and combed the surrounding countryside. Some villagers reported hearing noises near the inn that night. Footsteps, hushed voices, perhaps a scuffle, but nothing definitive. Days later, Bathurst's fur coat was found hidden in a stable. Soon after, his trousers turned up in a woodshed, folded as if deliberately placed there. This only deepened the mystery. Were these items planted to throw investigators off? Or did they signal that Bathurst had been attacked and stripped of valuables? The lack of blood or damage on the clothing made things even stranger. The search widened, but there was no trace of the man himself. No body, no ransom note, no witnesses who could place him after he stepped out of the inn. For a figure as important as Bathurst, the silence was deafening. Theories began to swirl. The most obvious explanation was that he had been assassinated or abducted by French intelligence. Bathurst had been in Austria negotiating alliances against Napoleon, and it was no secret that French spies operated deep within German territories. To them, eliminating a British envoy would send a chilling message. Nowhere was safe. Another theory, though less dramatic, suggested Bathurst had been killed by common criminals. Northern Germany at the time was plagued by bandits who preyed on travellers. But again, where was the body? If robbery was the motive, why hide the clothing so carefully? Some even whispered that Bathurst had staged his own disappearance. Perhaps the strain of diplomacy, the fear of capture, or even madness drove him to abandon his post and live anonymously under a new identity. After all, there had been reports of him acting strangely in the days before, paranoid and restless. But this theory never gained much traction. Bathurst was ambitious, well-connected and young, hardly the type to throw everything away. The lack of answers led to wilder ideas. One local legend claimed that Bathurst was murdered by townspeople who resented his presence, and that they conspired to cover it up. Another rumour had it that he had been swallowed by the earth itself, vanishing into one of the strange sinkholes that dotted the German countryside, a supernatural explanation born of frustration. Back in Britain, Bathurst's family pressured the government for answers, but nothing concrete emerged. Napoleon himself, when asked about the case years later while in exile, denied any involvement. With his characteristic irony, he supposedly remarked, "Bathurst? I never heard of him. He was of no importance." Was that the truth, or Napoleon's way of twisting the knife? Over the decades, the Bathurst mystery grew into a cautionary tale of espionage and paranoia. Victorian writers picked it up as an example of how even the mighty could disappear without a trace. In some retellings, Bathurst became almost a ghost story, the diplomat who stepped outside and never came back, a warning about the dangers of intrigue. And yet, no matter how many theories circulate, the core mystery remains unsolved. If Bathurst had been killed by robbers, his body should have been found. If by French agents, some record should have surfaced in captured archives. If he had fled, some trace of his later life should exist. Instead, nothing. That silence has made Benjamin Bathurst a symbol of the unexplained. Unlike a soldier lost on the battlefield or a sailor drowned at sea, he vanished from a place of relative safety, in front of witnesses, in the middle of civilization. That gap between expectation and reality is what keeps his story alive. When we look at Bathurst's disappearance today, it feels like a puzzle missing its final piece. Every explanation makes some sense, but none fit perfectly. And perhaps that's why his case continues to fascinate. It isn't just about one man's fate, it's about how easily history can swallow even the powerful, leaving behind only unanswered questions. Benjamin Bathurst walked into the night in 1809 and was never seen again. More than 2 centuries later, we're still asking the same question his valet must have asked that night. Where did he go? On the morning of December 12, 1910, the streets of New York City bustled with the usual pre-Christmas chaos. Shops were crowded, Fifth Avenue was alive with carriages and pedestrians, and winter sunlight glinted off store windows. Among the fashionable women walking down the street was Dorothy Harriet Camille Arnold, a 25-year-old socialite from one of New York's most prominent families. She had every privilege. Dorothy was the daughter of Francis Arnold, a wealthy perfume importer and a relative of Benjamin Franklin. Her family lived in a mansion on the Upper East Side, surrounded by wealth and connections. Dorothy herself was educated at Bryn Mawr College, fluent in French and Italian, and moved comfortably among New York's elite. Yet Dorothy wasn't content to simply be a socialite. She wanted to make her own mark as a writer. She dreamed of publishing short stories, of carving out an identity that was more than just her father's daughter. But her attempts at getting published had been met with rejection. Editors dismissed her work as unpolished. Behind her fashionable exterior, Dorothy carried quiet frustrations. On that December morning, she left her family home on East 79th Street, telling her mother she was going shopping for a new evening gown. She dressed smartly in a navy blue suit, a long coat, and a wide-brimmed hat, the picture of respectability. She carried about $25, a comfortable sum for errands, and walked into the city. Witnesses later recalled her movements. Around noon, she stopped at Park and Tilford, an upscale grocery store, to buy chocolates. She then visited Brentano's bookstore on Fifth Avenue, where she purchased a copy of an engaged girl's sketches. At the checkout, she ran into a friend, Gladys King, who asked if she wanted to join her for a walk. Dorothy declined, saying she was going to meet her mother in the afternoon. That casual conversation was the last confirmed sighting of Dorothy Arnold. When she failed to return home that evening, her family grew anxious. But at first, they hesitated to involve the police. The Arnolds were a proud and prominent family, and Francis Arnold worried that public scandal would embarrass them. Instead, he discreetly contacted private investigators, hoping the matter could be handled quietly. Days passed with no sign of Dorothy. She hadn't returned to her family's home, hadn't contacted friends, and hadn't withdrawn money from her bank accounts. Her disappearance was completely out of character. Finally, after weeks of silence, the family admitted the truth. Dorothy was missing. The case became front-page news. A wealthy young woman vanishing in broad daylight on one of the busiest streets in New York was a sensation. Reporters speculated wildly. Had she been kidnapped, attacked in Central Park, or had she vanished by choice, escaping the pressures of high society? What made the case even more suspicious was her father's evasiveness. Francis Arnold openly dismissed the idea of kidnapping, claiming no ransom had been demanded. He also rejected the possibility of insisting his daughter had no reason to end her life. But his reluctance to cooperate fully with investigators raised eyebrows. Some wondered if the family was hiding something, protecting their name at the expense of the truth. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed Dorothy had been secretly meeting a man her father disapproved of, George Griscom Jr., a wealthy but idle young man from Pittsburgh. Dorothy had visited him earlier that year, and her father had strongly objected. Could she have been with him on the day she disappeared? Griscom denied it, but the suspicion lingered. Others suggested Dorothy had died during a botched illegal abortion, a grim but common risk for women in that era. According to whispers, the family might have learned of it and covered it up to avoid disgrace. There was no proof, but the rumour stuck because it explained both the disappearance and the family's secrecy. As weeks turned into months, the trail went cold. New York was scoured, rivers were dragged and hospitals were checked, but no Dorothy. For all the theories, there was nothing solid, just a young woman who walked into a December afternoon and never returned. By the time Dorothy Arnold's family was forced to go public with the case, the newspapers of New York had already turned the story into front-page drama. Dorothy wasn't just any missing person. She was the daughter of a wealthy perfume importer, a young socialite who attended balls, had connections in high society, and was supposed to be preparing for marriage. Her sudden vanishing was irresistible fodder for headlines. The press quickly branded it the mystery of the missing heiress. Reporters swarmed the Arnold family mansion on East 79th Street, desperate for details. The family, embarrassed by the scandal, initially refused to give interviews. But when weeks passed with no sign of Dorothy, they reluctantly cooperated with police and detectives. Private investigators followed rumors as far as Boston, Philadelphia, and even Europe. Each lead seemed more bizarre than the last. A woman claimed to have seen Dorothy in a hospital, badly injured. Another said she spotted her boarding a ship for Italy under a false name. A maid swore she recognized Dorothy walking down a street in California. None of these sightings could ever be confirmed. Meanwhile, detectives began to dig into Dorothy's personal life. They discovered she had literary ambitions and had even submitted short stories to magazines, though all were rejected. Her family dismissed her writing as a hobby, but Dorothy took it seriously. Some theorists suggested she may have staged her own disappearance out of humiliation, hoping to reinvent herself somewhere new. But if that were true, why hadn't she contacted anyone in 1911 or 1920 or ever again? Romance also entered the investigation. Dorothy had been quietly involved with a man named George Griscom Jr., a wealthy but aimless young man from Pennsylvania. Her family strongly disapproved of him, believing he was irresponsible. When Dorothy disappeared, suspicion fell on Griscom. Investigators questioned him, but he swore he hadn't seen her since the summer before she vanished. He even published a statement declaring his innocence, insisting he had no knowledge of Dorothy's fate. Some thought he might be hiding her, or that perhaps the couple had tried to elope and something went wrong. But again, no evidence. By 1911, rumors had spun completely out of control. Some said Dorothy had slipped into Central Park that December afternoon and been murdered. Others whispered that she had gone to a doctor for a secret abortion, which ended tragically. The family vehemently denied these rumors, but the whispers never stopped. Still others believed she had been kidnapped for ransom, but no ransom note ever arrived. Perhaps the most unsettling detail was the total absence of Dorothy's belongings. She carried money that day, enough to cover lunch or a carriage ride, but her purse, her clothing, and any personal items were never recovered. If foul play had occurred, the perpetrator had erased almost every trace. As years passed, the case grew colder, yet it refused to die. Every so often, newspapers revived the story with a new theory. In 1916, authorities dug up part of a property in Pennsylvania after rumors spread that Dorothy's body had been buried there. Nothing was found. In 1921, a young woman arrested in California claimed she was Dorothy Arnold. Detectives rushed to verify her identity, only to discover it was yet another false lead. Dorothy's father died in 1922, never knowing what became of his daughter. Her mother passed in 1928, carrying the same torment. The family's silence only deepened the mystery. Some historians believe they may have known more than they ever revealed. Even today, the disappearance of Dorothy Arnold remains one of America's strangest unsolved cases. How does a young woman vanish on Fifth Avenue in broad daylight with hundreds of people around? No body, no confirmed sightings, just a trail of whispers. Dorothy's story closes the circle of our theme, people who seemed too visible, too connected, too important to simply disappear. Yet history shows again and again, it happens. And when it does, The void they leave behind is filled not with answers, but with speculation, suspicion, and endless fascination. Raoul Wallenberg's story is one of the rare moments in history when courage seems almost superhuman. Born into one of Sweden's most prominent families, Wallenberg could have lived a comfortable, quiet life. Instead, he chose danger. During World War II, as Europe descended into chaos and Nazi brutality reached its peak, Wallenberg stepped into Budapest, a city on the brink of destruction, and changed the course of countless lives. By 1944, the Holocaust had already swept across Europe. Hungary was among the last nations to face the full terror of Nazi deportations, and when Adolf Eichmann arrived in Budapest, his mission was clear: to send Hungary's Jewish population, hundreds of thousands of people, to Auschwitz. The world largely looked away. Governments issued protests, but little else. Wallenberg did not. Sent by Sweden, with American backing, he arrived in Budapest in July 1944, armed with nothing more than diplomatic status, determination, and a portfolio of bold ideas. His greatest weapon was the Schutzpass, a protective passport. Printed with the Swedish coat of arms, stamped and signed with diplomatic flair, these documents declared the bearer under the protection of Sweden. In truth, they had no binding power, but Wallenberg's confidence made them work. To Nazi officers, to arrow-crossed thugs patrolling the streets, they looked official enough to pause execution, deportation, or imprisonment. That pause often meant survival. But Wallenberg didn't stop at paperwork. He rented buildings across Budapest, declaring them Swedish property, and filled them with Jewish families. These became the legendary Swedish houses, islands of refuge amid the terror. He organized food, medical care, and resistance networks. He personally stood at train stations, pulling terrified men, women, and children off cattle cars, bound for Auschwitz, thrusting Schutzpasses into their hands. Accounts say he was fearless, walking into groups of armed guards, unshaken by threats, demanding the release of those under his protection. By the time the Soviet army closed in on Budapest in early 1945, Wallenberg's actions had saved tens of thousands of lives. He should have returned home a hero. Instead, his story took one of the strangest and most tragic turns of the 20th century. On January 17, 1945, Wallenberg set out in a Soviet car, accompanied by Red Army officers. The stated purpose was for him to meet with Soviet commanders about the future of Jewish relief efforts in Hungary. But he never returned. That day was the last time he was seen as a free man. For weeks, rumors spread. Perhaps he had been detained temporarily for questioning. Perhaps the Soviets, suspicious of his ties to the United States, were keeping him under protective custody. But as the months dragged on, no word came. The war ended, Europe was rebuilding, and Raoul Wallenberg had vanished into the vast machinery of the Soviet state. At first, the Soviets denied everything. They claimed to have no knowledge of his whereabouts. Later, in the 1950s, they admitted he had been arrested and imprisoned. Then, in 1957, they issued a shocking statement. Wallenberg, they claimed, had died of a heart attack in Moscow's Lubyanka prison in July 1947. The world was expected to accept this two-sentence explanation and move on. But not everyone did. Reports trickled out of the Soviet Union. Whispers from former prisoners who claimed they had seen a tall, blonde foreigner who matched Wallenberg's description. Some said he was alive in the 1950s. Others swore he was still there in the 1960s, locked away in psychiatric wards or isolated cells. The Soviets dismissed these as mistaken identities or fabrications. Yet, the consistency of the testimonies across decades kept hope alive. What had happened to Raoul Wallenberg? Why would the Soviets, who had every reason to praise him for opposing the Nazis, instead erase him? Was it suspicion of his American connections, his family's wealth, or secrets he carried about wartime dealings between Germany, Sweden, and the Allies? Wallenberg's disappearance became more than a personal tragedy. It became a Cold War mystery, a symbol of how individuals could be swallowed by the opaque silence of the Soviet system. A man who had risked everything to save others had himself been stolen away, leaving the world with questions that have never been fully answered. And that is where we turn next. The competing theories, the fragmentary evidence, and the haunting possibility that Raoul Wallenberg may have lived in captivity long after the world believed him dead. The Soviet claim that Raoul Wallenberg had died of a heart attack in July 1947 might have been accepted, if not for the flood of contradictions that followed. For decades, stories emerged from behind the Iron Curtain that suggested Wallenberg had not only survived 1947, but had lived on, trapped within the Soviet prison system. One of the most compelling accounts came from prisoners who later managed to leave the Gulag. They spoke of a foreign diplomat held under strict secrecy, a man who seemed isolated from others, watched more closely than the average inmate. In 1949, a German prisoner swore he had shared a cell with a Swede in Moscow's Lubyanka prison. Others described seeing a man in the 1950s in Vladimir prison, east of Moscow, whose appearance and mannerisms matched Wallenberg's. Even as late as the 1970s, rumours circulated of a mysterious prisoner number 7, a man never identified but treated as if his existence was classified. Some researchers believe this prisoner was Wallenberg himself. Why would the Soviets have kept him alive, and why so secret? Several theories attempt to explain this. One possibility is simple Cold War paranoia. Wallenberg's mission in Budapest, though humanitarian, had been backed by American intelligence channels. To Stalin's suspicious regime, anyone with ties to the West could be a spy, or at least someone worth interrogating indefinitely. Wallenberg, with his family's financial connections and his proximity to secret wartime negotiations, may have seemed too valuable to release and too dangerous to acknowledge. Another theory suggests Wallenberg knew too much about Sweden's wartime dealings with Nazi Germany. Officially neutral, Sweden had maintained trade with Germany, even as the Allies fought Hitler. Wallenberg, moving in diplomatic circles, might have carried knowledge the Soviets considered leverage. By detaining him, they ensured he could never reveal or complicate sensitive information. A darker theory is that Wallenberg's capture was an accident. He was arrested under vague suspicion, and once imprisoned, the bureaucracy of the Soviet security system simply never let him go. In Stalin's USSR, people often vanished into prisons for years, their identities lost in paperwork or deliberately erased. If Wallenberg was swept into that system, he may have become a prisoner too prominent to release, yet too awkward to admit holding. Whatever the reason, the Soviet silence only fueled international pressure. Sweden, long criticized for its soft approach, began to demand answers more forcefully. The United States, Israel, and humanitarian groups all pressed Moscow for clarification. Yet every inquiry ended with stonewalling or vague assurances. When the Soviets finally admitted in 1957 that Wallenberg had died 10 years earlier, their explanation was so flimsy that few believed it. The Wallenberg family never gave up hope. His mother and half-siblings spent decades campaigning for his release, writing to world leaders, visiting Moscow, and pressing for declassification of records. Their fight turned Wallenberg's case into more than a mystery. It became a moral test of the Soviet Union's willingness to tell the truth. Sadly, his mother and stepfather both died in the 1970s without closure, convinced their son was still alive somewhere behind Soviet bars. As late as the 1980s, the Wallenberg case resurfaced in headlines. In 1989, as the Soviet Union began to loosen under Mikhail Gorbachev, officials turned over some of Wallenberg's personal belongings, his passport, notebooks and money, claiming these were found in archives. It was the first concrete acknowledgement that he had indeed been in Soviet custody. But it raised more questions than answers. If he truly died in 1947, why had his possessions been preserved for 4 decades? Even after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian authorities have never produced a body, a grave, or definitive proof of his death. Researchers granted limited access to prison files found tantalizing references to an unidentified prisoner who could have been Wallenberg, but the trail always stopped short of certainty. In 2016, Sweden officially declared Wallenberg dead, acknowledging that he had likely been executed or perished in captivity. Yet the lack of final evidence keeps the door to speculation wide open. Raoul Wallenberg's disappearance remains one of history's cruelest ironies. A man who saved tens of thousands from Nazi death camps was himself consumed by another regime's machinery of repression. His legacy is celebrated. He is honored in Israel as one of the righteous among the nations. His name graces streets and monuments around the world. But his personal fate is still unresolved. And maybe that unresolved nature is precisely why his story endures. Wallenberg stands as a symbol not only of courage, but of how even the most heroic individuals can be lost in the fog of politics and secrecy. His disappearance is not just a question. Through the strange disappearances of Victor Grayson, Ambrose Bierce, Benjamin Bathurst, and Dorothy Arnold, a theme has emerged. These were not anonymous figures who could vanish without notice. Each was well known in their own sphere, a rising political star, a celebrated writer, a diplomat entangled in Europe's wars, and a young heiress whose life should have been secure in the heart of New York's high society. These were people whose names carried weight, whose movements should have been traceable, and yet they slipped into the shadows, leaving behind only silence and questions. Victor Grayson's case revealed how disappearance can serve as a weapon of politics. Here was a fiery orator, someone who spoke for the working class at a time when Britain's political balance was fragile. Did his outspokenness make him a target? Was he silenced to preserve the status quo? His absence reshaped the political landscape of his day and became a chilling reminder of how easily inconvenient voices can vanish without explanation. Ambrose Bierce, by contrast, symbolized the romantic allure of mystery. The author of biting satire and haunting tales of war simply walked into Mexico and evaporated from history. Was it a tragic misstep, a planned farewell, or something darker? Bierce's vanishing blurred the line between fact and legend, feeding a mythology that keeps his name alive far longer than if he had simply lived out his final years quietly. Sometimes, disappearance itself becomes a form of immortality. Benjamin Bathurst's story took us into the cloak and dagger world of Napoleonic Europe. A diplomat who knew too much, operating at a time when shifting alliances and espionage were daily realities, simply steps into the night and is never seen again. His disappearance became a tale told across Europe, proof of the perils of politics conducted in the shadows, where human lives could be erased as casually as altering a treaty. And then Dorothy Arnold, a story that feels modern despite happening in 1910. A young woman from privilege, walking in broad daylight down Fifth Avenue, vanishes without leaving a single trace. Was it a crime, a desperate escape, or a cover-up? The unanswered questions still linger more than a century later, reminding us that even in the heart of a bustling metropolis surrounded by people, one person can simply cease to exist. What links all of these disappearances is not just the absence of answers, but the presence of possibility. Each theory, murder, espionage, voluntary flight, conspiracy, opens a different door. And because no door has ever been definitively closed, the stories live on. The human mind despises loose ends. We crave neat conclusions. Yet history is full of frayed threads that resist being tied together. There is also something haunting about how disappearance strips away certainty. A death certificate, a gravestone, even the testimony of witnesses. These provide closure, however painful. But a disappearance leaves behind a void. Loved ones don't know whether to mourn or to hope. Entire societies spin stories to fill the emptiness, turning real people into legends, symbols, or cautionary tales. Perhaps that's why we remain so fascinated by these mysteries. They reflect a deep fear that no matter our status, intelligence, or wealth, we too could one day step out into the world and never return. But they also reflect a strange allure. To disappear is, in some sense, to escape the finality of death. Bierce, Bathurst, Grayson, and Arnold are all frozen in time, their stories never reaching a clear end, and so they linger with us. As we close, consider this. Maybe the real lesson of these disappearances is not about the missing individuals, but about us, the ones left behind. It is our need for answers, our refusal to let go, that keeps these names alive long after their physical presence vanished. History doesn't just record facts, it remembers mysteries. And sometimes, the mysteries speak louder than the facts ever could. The stories of Victor Grayson, Ambrose Bierce, Benjamin Bathurst, and Dorothy Arnold belong to different countries, different decades, even different worlds of politics, literature, and society. Yet they all share a strange, unsettling common ground, the moment when a human being with all their complexities and connections simply vanishes from the pages of history. Disappearance is different from death. Death is final, documented, something you can place on a timeline. Disappearance is absence without closure, a story with the ending ripped out. It creates a vacuum that demands to be filled. And so, in every case we've explored, speculation rushed in to take the place of facts. For Victor Grayson, the void became political. A socialist voice silenced at the peak of his power, his vanishing turned into whispers of murder or government conspiracy. For Ambrose Bierce, the void became legend, the writer who wrote about death and shadows now forever tied to his own mysterious fate in a foreign land. For Benjamin Bathurst, the void became espionage folklore, a man in the middle of Napoleon's Europe, a stage of spies and shifting loyalties, disappearing as though swallowed by the war itself. And for Dorothy Arnold, the void became scandal and rumour, a young woman of privilege, her life dissected by newspapers, every theory from elopement to crime to family secrets layered over her absence. What makes these stories so haunting is how little separates them from our own time. We live in an age of satellites, cell phones, and constant digital footprints. And yet, people still vanish. Planes disappear from radar. Hikers leave for a trail and never return. Influential figures step into a car, walk down a street, or board a flight and are never seen again. The 20th and 21st centuries have their own unsolved vanishings, proving that even with all our technology, mystery is not a relic of the past. There is also something symbolic in these stories. They remind us that power, fame, or wealth does not make one immune to the chaos of existence. Dorothy Arnold had wealth, Benjamin Bathurst had diplomatic protection, Victor Grayson had political recognition, Ambrose Bierce had literary fame, and none of it mattered. In the end, they were as vulnerable as anyone. Their vanishings remind us of a humbling truth. Life offers no guarantees of explanation. But disappearance also gifts a strange kind of immortality. A resolved death fades into history books. A disappearance lingers in imagination. We continue to ask questions, continue to debate possibilities, continue to wonder. In that sense, the missing never truly leave us. They occupy a permanent place in the realm of speculation, where they can never be forgotten. Perhaps that is why these stories matter. They are not just unsolved cases, they are reflections of our relationship with uncertainty. Humans hate unanswered questions. We construct theories, conspiracies, and entire myths to fill the silence. The truth may be mundane, a robbery gone wrong, an accident, a mistake, but in the absence of proof, our minds prefer the extraordinary. That instinct ensures that these names live on, century after century, not as closed chapters, but as haunting echoes. So, as you finish this journey through history's strangest vanishings, take one thought with you. Disappearance is not just a physical event. It is a psychological one. It unsettles societies, rewrites reputations, and keeps history open-ended. And in that way, the missing become timeless. Victor Grayson, Ambrose Bierce, Benjamin Bathurst, Dorothy Arnold. They stepped into the shadows and we never saw them again. But perhaps that's the point. Their absence has made them eternal. Their stories do not end because they cannot end. And as long as people are drawn to the mysterious, the unsolved, and the unexplainable, these vanishings will remain alive, whispering to us from the darkness of history.